In the hush before history had a name, when the world was still unscarred and every breath of wind carried the quiet promise of unbroken fellowship, a single moment rose like a trembling note suspended between innocence and awakening, holding within it the weight of every choice humanity would ever make and the echo of a love that refused to let the story end. The garden breathed with a kind of living stillness, its air warm with the fragrance of untouched creation, where every leaf shimmered with purpose and every sound felt like a whisper of the one who had shaped it all. Adam walked with the ease of someone who had never known fear, his steps unhurried as he moved through the soft glow of morning, while Eve traced her fingers along the petals of flowers that seemed to bloom simply because she noticed them. Nothing in this place hinted at danger. Nothing suggested that trust could fracture or that innocence could be lost. Yet beneath the canopy of branches, heavy with fruit, a quiet tension stirred, subtle as a shadow shifting where no shadow should be. The serpent watched with eyes that reflected more than the garden's beauty, carrying a cunning that did not belong to this world of harmony. It moved with a grace that drew no suspicion, its voice curling through the air with a softness that felt almost familiar. Eve turned toward it, not with fear, but with curiosity, unaware that this moment would become the hinge upon which the entire human story would turn. The serpent's question slipped into the stillness like a thread of smoke, twisting truth just enough to make it shimmer with doubt. Eve listened, her heart steady, her mind unguarded. The fruit before her, glowing with a beauty she had never paused to consider. Adam stood nearby, close enough to hear, close enough to intervene, yet silent as the weight of the serpent's words settled over them both. The garden seemed to hold its breath, creation waiting for the choice that would ripple through every generation to come. And as the tension deepened, let your heart stay open to the gravity of this moment. And if this journey speaks to you, let your voice be heard in the comments as we walk through this sacred turning point together. Eve's hand hovered over the fruit, her breath caught between hesitation and desire, as the serpent's words wrapped themselves around her thoughts with a strange and unsettling allure. The fruit, once simply part of the garden's abundance, now seemed to pulse with possibility, as though it held a secret she had been denied. She looked toward Adam, searching his face for reassurance. But he remained still, his silence becoming its own kind of permission. The serpent's promise lingered in the air, whispering of wisdom, of opened eyes, of becoming something more than they had been. The garden, once vibrant with harmony, now felt heavy with the weight of a choice that neither of them fully understood. Eve reached out, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the fruit, and in that touch something shifted, an innocence trembling on the edge of surrender. She lifted it, feeling its weight, its warmth, its strange invitation. The moment stretched, suspended between obedience and curiosity, between trust and the subtle pull of autonomy. Then, with a quiet resolve that surprised even her, she brought the fruit to her lips and tasted what had never been meant for her to know. The sweetness filled her mouth, unfamiliar and intoxicating, and she turned to Adam with eyes that seemed both the same and somehow changed. Adam received the fruit from her hand, his heart pounding with a confusion he could not name. He looked at her, at the garden, at the sky that had always felt so close, and in a single breath he chose to join her, not out of deception, but out of a bond he could not bear to break. As he ate, the world around them seemed to shift, colors dimming, air thickening, a quiet ache settling into the very soil beneath their feet. And in that moment, the first fracture entered creation, subtle yet irreversible, as the story began its descent toward a sorrow neither of them could yet comprehend. Lord, as we stand before this ancient moment, we feel the tremor of a choice that echoes through every corner of our own hearts. For the temptation that whispered to Eve and the silence that held Adam are not distant relics, but living patterns woven into the fabric of our humanity. We see in their longing the same ache that stirs within us, the desire to grasp what seems withheld. The pull toward autonomy, the quiet belief that we can shape our own wisdom apart from you. Their story becomes a mirror, revealing the subtle ways we drift, the gentle compromises that lead us away from the simplicity of trust. We come before you with a humility that recognizes how easily we listen to voices that twist truth into something almost convincing, how quickly we reach for what promises more than it can ever give. We confess the moments when we have stood in Adam's silence, watching choices unfold without stepping into the courage of obedience, and the moments when we have stood in Eve's curiosity, letting desire overshadow the clarity of your word. Yet even as we acknowledge these patterns, we feel your presence drawing near, not with condemnation, but with the tenderness of a Father who knows our frailty. Let this story soften our hearts, Lord, not with shame, but with a renewed longing for the intimacy that was lost. Let it awaken in us a deeper awareness of the subtle ways temptation approaches, not with force, but with suggestion, not with threat, but with invitation. And as we reflect on this moment, if this prayer is stirring something within you, consider sharing it so that others may join us in seeking the restoration only God can bring. The moment their eyes opened, the world seemed to tilt, as though creation itself recoiled from the fracture that had just torn through its center. Adam and Eve looked at one another, and for the first time, the purity of their gaze faltered, replaced by an awareness that felt sharp and unwelcome. Innocence slipped from them like a garment they could no longer hold, and in its place came a vulnerability that pressed against their hearts with unfamiliar weight. They reached for leaves, fumbling to cover themselves, their hands trembling as they tried to hide what had never needed hiding. The garden, once a sanctuary of unbroken communion, now felt foreign, its beauty shadowed by the ache settling into their souls. Every sound seemed louder, every movement sharper, as though the harmony that had once embraced them now stood at a distance. They heard the rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind, the distant call of creatures who sensed the shift, and beneath it all, a quiet dread began to rise. For the first time, they felt the instinct to hide, not from danger, but from the one whose presence had always been their joy. When the sound of the Lord walking in the garden reached them, it carried a weight they had never felt before, a mixture of longing and fear that pulled them in opposite directions. They slipped into the shadows, hearts pounding, breath unsteady, as though distance could shield them from the truth of what they had done. The Lord's voice called out, gentle yet searching, a question that pierced through the foliage and into the deepest part of their souls. Where are you? And as the echo of that question lingered, let it draw you deeper into this moment. And if this journey is resonating with you, consider adding your voice in the comments as we continue. Lord, as we listen to the question you spoke into the garden, where are you? We recognize it as the question you still speak into the hidden places of our lives. You do not ask because you lack knowledge. You ask because you seek relationship, because you long for us to step out of the shadows we create when shame settles over our hearts. Adam and Eve hid among the trees, believing distance could protect them from the weight of their choices, yet you approached with a tenderness that reveals your heart even in judgment. We bring before you the places where we hide, the corners of our souls where fear whispers that we are too broken, too compromised, too far gone to be met with grace. We confess the instinct to cover ourselves with excuses, distractions, or silence, hoping to avoid the vulnerability of being fully seen. Yet your voice calls to us still, not with accusation, but with invitation, drawing us out of hiding and into the light where healing begins. Let this moment teach us to answer you with honesty, to step toward you, even when our hearts tremble, trusting that your presence is not a threat, but a refuge. Let it remind us that shame is not the end of the story, that even in the aftermath of failure, your desire is restoration, not abandonment. And as this prayer settles into your spirit, if it is awakening something within you, consider sharing it so others may be drawn into the same gentle call of God's pursuing love. Adam stepped forward from the shadows, his voice unsteady as he answered the Lord, the weight of his words revealing the fracture that had already begun to spread through their relationship. Eve followed, her heart heavy, her gaze lowered. The innocence that once defined them now replaced by a vulnerability that felt raw and exposed. The Lord listened, his presence steady, his sorrow palpable, for the creation he had called good now bore the mark of rebellion, and the children he loved stood trembling before him. The serpent's deception was named, its cunning unmasked, and judgment flowed with a solemnity that carried both justice and grief. The ground that had once yielded abundance with ease would now resist, thorns rising where beauty once flourished. Pain would enter their story, threading itself through the generations to come. Yet even in the pronouncement of consequence, a thread of hope shimmered, the promise that one day a descendant of the woman would crush the serpent's head, though his own heel would be wounded in the process. It was a promise whispered into the brokenness, a light placed at the far end of a long and shadowed road. Adam and Eve listened, their hearts aching. Yet something within them stirred at the sound of that promise, a faint echo of the love that had shaped them. The Lord made garments for them, clothing their shame with his own hands. A gesture of tenderness that revealed his heart even in the midst of judgment. And as they prepared to leave the garden, the weight of exile pressing upon them, let your heart remain open to the gravity of this moment. And if this journey is speaking to you, consider adding your voice in the comments as we continue. Lord, as we stand at the edge of Eden with Adam and Eve, we feel the ache of loss, the heaviness of exile, and the quiet hope woven into your promise of redemption. Their story becomes our story, for we too know what it is to step beyond the boundaries of your will, to feel the distance that grows when trust is fractured, and to long for the intimacy we were created to enjoy. Yet even here, in the shadow of the garden's closed gate, your mercy shines with a tenderness that refuses to let brokenness have the final word. We reflect on the garments you fashioned for them, a gesture that reveals your heart more clearly than any explanation could. You covered their shame with your own hands, showing that even in judgment, your desire is to restore, to protect, to draw near. We see in this moment the first hint of the redemption you would one day accomplish through Christ, the one who would bear the full weight of our exile so that we might be brought home again. The promise spoken in the garden becomes the thread that leads us through every chapter of Scripture. Every longing of the human heart, every whisper of hope that rises in the darkness. We bring before you the places where we feel the ache of separation, the wounds we carry from choices made in weakness, the fears that linger when we consider the distance between who we are and who you created us to be. We ask for the courage to trust your mercy, to believe that your love reaches even into the places we try to hide, and to rest in the truth that you are always drawing us back toward yourself. Let this story awaken in us a deeper longing for the restoration you offer, a longing that leads us not into despair, but into the quiet confidence that your grace is greater than our failure. We pray for the strength to walk with humility, to recognize the subtle ways temptation still approaches, and to cling to the promise that you have already begun the work of redemption in us. Let the memory of Eden not be a source of shame, but a reminder of the intimacy we were created for and the future you are leading us toward. And as we stand in this sacred tension between what was lost and what will one day be restored, let our hearts remain open to your presence, trusting that you are the God who meets us even in exile and leads us gently home. As we step back from the gates of Eden and feel the weight of this ancient moment settle into our hearts, may the tenderness of God's pursuing love draw you toward the hope that has always been woven through the story. And if this prayer has stirred something deep within you, consider sharing it so others may be invited into the same quiet journey of restoration.